In this section, we'll look at Kennedy's foreign policy in general and also at some of his initiatives early on in foreign aid and in the space program. Certainly, when John F. Kennedy entered the White House in January 1961, the Cold War was very hot. The U-2 incident had only been months before, and the repercussions were still unfolding. Kennedy proved the consummate Cold Warrior. Democrats had always been under attack by Republicans for being weak on national defense, and Kennedy wanted to project a commanding presence. In fact, he'd even criticized Eisenhower for inaction, so he had a lot to live up to. Kennedy supported Eisenhower's nuclear buildup and the threat of massive retaliation. At the same time, however, Kennedy insisted that he needed to spend more on traditional, conventional weapons, tanks, airplanes, and troops that allow him a wider range of options to respond to Soviet aggression. JFK's plan became known as flexible response, implemented by his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. With both an expanded nuclear arsenal and an expanded conventional warfare capability, Kennedy had assured that no nation or political opponent would think him weak in foreign policy. Agreeing with NSC 68 that every third world country was very valuable, Kennedy focused much of his Defense Department on preparing for combat in such regions. Fighting in underdeveloped, often inhospitable climates with close combat with both civilians and the enemy required special combat training and skills. As a result, Kennedy encouraged the expansion of the Army Special Forces, termed the Green Berets after the caps they wore as a distinction. Kennedy also agreed that a good way to bolster anti-communism in the Third World was to stimulate economic growth and progress in trade. While Congress frequently cut Kennedy's foreign aid request, it approved his plan for Latin American aid, the so-called Alliance for Progress. Formally launched at an Inter-American Conference in Uruguay in August 1961 and signed by all the American republics except Cuba, the Alliance for Progress promised a massive 10-year program for economic and social development. It promised at least $20 billion in aid, over half to be provided by the United States, and the balance by international agencies, European countries, and private capital. Although Congress frequently cut Kennedy's foreign aid request, Kennedy issued an executive order in 1961 to create the Agency for International Development, or AID, a body to process and facilitate distribution of foreign aid. Its mission statement spoke of ending poverty abroad and enhancing the security of the United States. Although technically an independent agency, AID has been subject to the guidance of the White House and the State Department. The Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 formalized AID's operations, splitting non-military aid from military aid and making AID responsible for most non-military aid. The money that AID had to distribute was in part determined by annual appropriations in Congress. Perhaps most famous of all JFK's AIDS programs was the Peace Corps, created by executive order in March 1961. The program trained volunteers for 2-year stints abroad, utilizing their own individual skills to improve the society in which they were placed. Personal contact with Americans would help win the minds and hearts of the people, the thinking went. Thousands of Americans volunteered, and Congress established the Peace Corps on a permanent basis in September 1961. When the Soviets launched a satellite, Sputnik, into space in 1957, it shocked many Americans because the Soviets seemed to have an advantage in rocket technology. Kennedy, therefore, appeared before a joint session of Congress on May 25, 1961, to announce a bold new initiative with major domestic and foreign policy implications. Kennedy wanted a crash program to send an American astronaut to the moon and back by the end of the decade. For years, the space program had competed with military objectives of developing a long-range ballistic missile systems. With military control of resources and technology effectively hampering any emphasis on space exploration, Kennedy's pledge helped sort of recast the debate in a new foreign policy light. Space, Kennedy insisted, was an issue of national security. Indeed, Kennedy's comments sort of signaled the beginning of the space race. Kennedy's comments were, in fact, only weeks after the Soviet Union had sent the first human into space. Yuri Gagarin in his Vostok 1 spacecraft both was the first human in space and the first to orbit the Earth on April 12, 1961. He became an international celebrity and got the highest honor that the Soviet Union could offer, the hero of the Soviet Union. He unfortunately died in a military test plane crash in 1968. The American National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or its acronym NASA, wanted to push a very robust space program, and indeed they launched the Mercury space program in 1959. And as part of that program, on May 5th, 1961, only a month after Gagarin's flight, the United States put Alan Shepard into space. It was the first American in space. It was only a 15-minute flight, and it's kind of funny because the blast off was delayed, but Shepard was strapped in. They couldn't get him out, and he had to urinate, and so he ended up urinating in his uniform and having the flight kind of wet. The next flight, by the way, NASA developed a urinary collection device. The following year, in February 1962, another Mercury pilot, John Glenn, became the first American to orbit the Earth, and Glenn later on became a senator from Ohio. This concludes the section on Kennedy's overall foreign policy and his initiatives in foreign aid and space.